Welcome to the last of our lectures. This one is over psychological disorders. I hope you'll find this one interesting. This is the stuff that always makes the news when somebody's got some kind of problem. We've seen a lot of that in the news lately with people that are doing school shootings and all kinds of issues. They're always in the news. They're always in the movies, and so it's quite popular. So let's get right down to it. The definition of a psychological disorder are behavioral patterns or mental processes that cause serious personal suffering or interfere with a person's ability to cope with everyday life. It's kind of your basic definition. You'll find something similar to this in most of your textbook you look at. Almost a fourth of adults in the U.S. have experienced some type of psychological disorder, so it's really quite common. Doesn't mean you're going to have it the rest of your life. It could be very temporary. But about a fourth have experienced some type of disorder. So the big question is, what is abnormal? The answer to this is primarily that the difference is that it's a simple exaggeration of behaviors. If I scratch my head, that's no big deal. People scratch their head all the time. But if I scratch my head once every 30 seconds, then that is over the top. Or an example I have there, laughing at inappropriate situations. If you go to a funeral and you bust out into laughter in the middle of a funeral when you're supposed to be thinking of something else, well, that obviously is something wrong. So that's what helps determine whether you've got something wrong or not. Now, the diagnosis is very difficult. Don't think just because you took a high school psychology class that you can go, oh, this is what he has. You can say, look, he's got the symptoms for something, but you're not going to be able to diagnose anything. It takes a lot of practice to do that. There are several criteria that determine the presence of a psychological disorder. The first one of these things is something called typicality. Does this behavior occur in a typical person? Now, it's not always really accurate. I mean, Albert Einstein was definitely not what you would consider a typical person, but you wouldn't necessarily say he had a psychological disorder. Actually, he was probably autistic, but he wore the same clothes every day. He had 5 suits, and he just rotated them. He didn't have any other clothes. Those were the 5 suits. They were all identical. He didn't have to waste any brain power in the morning figuring out what he was going to wear. So, but he was not typical, but you wouldn't necessarily say he had something wrong with him. Maladaptivity is another question. The behavior impairs a person's ability to function in everyday life. It could be hazardous to themselves or to others. I mean, is this really affecting your life in a negative way? That's what maladaptivity means. For an example, like somebody who's an alcoholic, if their life starts to spiral out of control because this alcohol has taken over their life. People who attempt suicides, obviously, that's going to affect the way you deal every day. Most criminals are not maladaptive because they're aware that they're committing a crime. Let me back that up. They are not necessarily have a psychological disorder because they know they're committing a crime. If they weren't aware of it, that's always the question in the courts. Now, were you aware that you were committing this crime? Well, if they tried to hide the murder weapon or they tried to evade the police in some way, then they know that they were aware of it. If you just claim temporary insanity and you say, yeah, I did it, I was, that's what I did, sorry, then there's a disorder there. Emotional discomfort's another thing. Does this cause anxiety, like a fear, which we'll talk about here shortly, or depression? That would be a criteria that has to be there. Feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, that I can't get out of this hole, and we'll talk about depression much more here shortly. And has to be some type of socially unacceptable behavior. Now, this depends on the culture. These things that, like if I come up to you every day and give you a kiss on the cheek, well, that's a little bit different when you're here. In France, that's what they do. If I'm constantly bowing or ducking my head when I see you, in some cultures, in some of the Asian cultures, that's what they do. But that is not what we do here. We shake somebody's hand. But if I was constantly, trying to avoid eye contact, that would be something we would consider an unacceptable behavior. These things are called culture-bound syndromes, behaviors that are treated differently in different cultures. At the end of dinner, if you're eating soup, in our culture, you with the spoon, but in other cultures you pick it up and slurp it down, or sometimes in some cultures you burp really loud at the end. This culture, not considered norm, but in others it's considered a compliment to the chef. So, to classify these things, what's often used is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's in its 4th edition. It has changed over the years. Originally, it was classified by presumed causes. You know, they say, oh, these are all the disorders that are caused by childhood abuse. These are disorders caused by viral infections. These are disorders caused by this or this or this. Well, you couldn't, it was a horrible way to organize it. You couldn't tell, you had to know what was the cause of the thing before you actually knew what it was, so it didn't make any sense. So now they've changed it around, and it's more by observable symptoms. Oh, they have this, they have this, they have this. This is what this must be their disorder. So makes much more sense, and it does take a professional to classify. You can't just go down to Barnes & Noble, buy the book, and open your own little store. Okay, so let's get into a couple of different types here. The first one is anxiety, a general state of dread or uneasiness that occurs in response to a vague or imagined danger. Now, this is different than fear, because fear is real danger. If I'm standing in my classroom and I've got a fear that a bear is going to attack me, the chance of a bear attacking me in my classroom is almost a bazillion to 1. Now, if I'm out in the woods, you know, on a hike in the Smoky Mountains, you know, carrying a bunch of meat with me, I got a much bigger chance of it. So fear is imagined danger, fear is real danger. Anxiety is imagined danger. You know, I'm not going to fall out of the window in my classroom to my death. That's anxiety. If I get over there close to it and I start breathing hard and you know, get dizzy, well, that's anxiety. Okay, so there's a difference between anxiety and fear. It's characterized by nervousness, inability to relax, concerns about losing control, all different kind of things like that. Your physical signs, you'd start to tremble, you sweat, your heart rate picks up, all these things that happen when you get really, really nervous. They are the most common of psychological disorders. A lot of people have these things. Some people have a social phobia, which we'll talk about here in a second, where they don't want to get up and speak in front of other people. There's no reason to be scared of it. People aren't going to attack you, but yet all these things happen. They start to sweat, they start to breathe really heavy, they hyperventilate. So very common among psychological disorders. There's a couple different types. The first one, like I mentioned, is a phobic disorder. Phobia is actually Greek for fear. It's an irrational fear of a particular object or situation, and it's the most common of anxiety disorders. Example, like zoophobia, fear of animals, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, acrophobia, fear of heights. There is a phobia for almost everything. If you can name an object, there's somebody out there who has a fear of it. A fear of aluminum foil, a fear of pencils, a fear of staplers, a fear of computers, a fear of anything you can look around the room and see. There's somebody out there with a fear of it. Now, how legitimate is it? Well, you know, it depends. A lot of people, I always have students say, oh, I've got a fear of tests, I've got test phobia. Well, that's just because you didn't prepare for the test, probably. It's not because you really have an actual fear of it. There's a social phobia, like I said, it's fear of being under the close scrutiny of other people's, like public speaking, going on a date, they'd be horrified of that. Eating in public, they don't like to eat in public because they fear something's going to go wrong. But there are more people, they say there are more people that fear speaking in front of public than dying. They're more afraid of talking in public than they are of actually dying. So they would actually rather be in the coffin than to be the one giving the eulogy at the funeral. So kind of an odd way to look at it, but it's a big fear. One of these phobias is a panic disorder or agoraphobia. They have these panic attacks. They believe they're going crazy or dying or something massive is happening. They will hyperventilate. They will start sweating. They will have to run out of the room. They will just lose it. It's a panic attack. Most people who have panic disorder have agoraphobia, fear of being someplace where escape will be difficult or impossible. If they were to go in the mall, they'd have to know where the exits are. What happens if something tragic happens there? Maybe they've seen too many movies and they think that somebody's going to attack them in a mall or a movie theater. It's a big wide open space that would scare them to death because it's hard to get out of a place like that, especially if there's a lot of other people there. All right, then there's generalized anxiety disorder. It's an excessive or unrealistic worry about life circumstances that last at least 6 months. What this means is they are worried about everything. If you've heard the expression, don't sweat the small stuff, these people sweat the small stuff. What happens if I lose my job? What happens if my wife gets sick? What happens if the kids get sick? What happens if I go to the hospital? We can't worry about those things. It would take over your life. It would consume you. And that's what it does in this particular disorder. These little problems consume them, and they can't get anything done because they're worried about all the little stuff. Finances, accidents, illness. It just totally takes their life over. Obsessive compulsive disorder is quite common. Obsessions are unwanted thoughts or ideas or images that occur over and over and over again. They can't get these things out of their mind. Some people that get into video games will start to obsess over it, and it's almost like they're living in a fantasy world. The compulsions, repetitive behaviors involve checking or cleaning. These compulsions relieve the obsessions. Let's say I am obsessed with dirt. Well, I am going to do something to get rid of it. Some people will wash their hands 100, 200 times a day. Now, it's one thing if it's your job to do that, but other people just will constantly worry, oh my gosh, I touched something, I've got to wash my hands. Or maybe they will dust their apartment several times a day. Maybe they'll vacuum several times a day because these ritual behaviors relax them because they relieve these obsessions. That's obsessive compulsive disorder. A hoarder is an example of an obsessive compulsive type of things. They want something, and so they constantly think about it. They don't want to waste anything, so they bring other things in there. If you've watched Hoarders on A&E or one of those channels, those people have an obsessive compulsive disorder. They can't get those things out of their mind. A couple types of stress disorders. There's two different types of these. You have a post-traumatic stress disorder. It's caused by an experience so traumatic that would cause stress in anyone, like rape, child abuse, assault, plane crash, war atrocities. A lot of these kids, they really didn't have many post-traumatic stress disorders until about the Vietnam War, when people had seen horrible things at war for years. Since the beginning of war, they witnessed atrocities that nobody should ever witness. But in the 60s, when they started to come back from Vietnam, we had a total shift. If something happened in World War II, these guys came back and you just took it. I mean, you didn't tell anybody about it. You didn't express your feelings. It was a total different mindset. Vietnam in the 60s, tell somebody about it. And, it wasn't that they witnessed things that were that much worse than the guys in the First World Wars, but it's now coming to the surface, and people are actually starting to notice it. And we're really noticing it now with these Iraq vets and Afghanistan vets that are coming back. A lot of them are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and the government's just now starting to help them out and give them counseling, help them pay for it, pay for counseling to get them back to normal. They might have flashbacks, they have nightmares, they can't get these visions that they've witnessed out of their head. The symptoms occur 6 or more months after the event. So they come back, they get back into society, get their old job back, and they start getting on with their life, maybe their wife and kids, and then all of a sudden, things start to go wrong, and nobody can figure it out. Like, hey, you've been back for 6 months, you should be over anything by now. So it's really, really a big deal. There's a lot of these kids that I think last year they had more suicides in the military than they had actual military deaths, and 90% of them were because of post-traumatic stress disorder. Acute stress disorder is something we'll talk about in the next little lecture.